Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to Session 5, Decolonisation of Volunteering for Development. The connection between colonisation and our work within the volunteering for development sector is undeniable. It obviously has historical context, the influence of global power dynamics, and of course the development that individual nations have travelled along. However, we now live in a new era where the principles of global equity are better understood, more actively embraced, and are fundamental to human rights across all societies. It is obviously a very complex picture, but for us in the volunteering for development sector, it's absolutely critical that we address and embrace this issue so that we can undertake our important work without undermining the principles of global equity. To help us with this, today's session brings together the knowledgeable and very interesting speakers. I'd firstly like to introduce Arathi Krishnan, who is the Strategic Foresight Advisor with UNDP, where she's designing the integration of a systems approach to foresight across the Asia-Pacific Bureau. She has 15 years global experience within the sector. Chris Malora is an interdisciplinary researcher who recently finished his PhD in Education and Development at the University of East Anglia, looking at the learning dimension of local volunteering among vulnerable groups in the Philippines. Lee Matthews is an experienced practitioner with over 17 years experience in the international development and social responsibility sectors, and who among many roles hosts the Good Problem podcast and is advisory board member for the Australian Volunteers International Child Safe Volunteering Hub. And finally, Nazmul Ahsan, who is the manager of the youth programming portfolio at ActionAid Bangladesh. He has over 10 years experience working within the development sector, focusing on youth programming and implementation of Agenda 2030. We're very fortunate to have Arathi, Chris, Lee and Nazmul with us for this session. And I encourage you to listen to what they have to say. And then when we have questions at the end, to engage them in discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to now invite Chris, who is our first speaker, to present.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much to Forum and IVCO for inviting me today. So my contribution to the discussion, to the panel today, will really focus on a particular aspect of any effort towards decolonizing volunteering and development. And for me, that is making the hierarchies of knowledge visible and the role that certain approaches to research might help us in challenging some of these hierarchies of knowledge. So what do I mean when I say hierarchies of knowledge? So when I speak of hierarchies of knowledge, I mean, or I'm referring to the way that certain definitions and concepts of volunteering and development are valued over others. And for me, efforts to decolonize should involve interrogating who has the power to name and to define as to what counts as volunteering and what counts as development. For the past couple of years, what I've done is I've conducted research into the learning dimension of local volunteering practices of so-called quote-unquote vulnerable youths and adults in the Philippines. So my interest was in understanding the dynamics of what happens when so-called marginalized groups are taking ownership and action towards shaping their own development. So when I started looking at the way the term volunteering is dominantly framed, this was when I was just starting my research, there was an image of a volunteer that came to fore, and that is a middle-class person, often coming from a well-off country, who has extra time, extra money, extra resources to help those that are needy. And while I understand that there's a lot of international volunteering schemes that have now focused on South-to-South volunteering and some other forms like this, there still seems to be a very persistent narrative that volunteers from so-called Global South are recipients of development programs coming from the North, or that the poor volunteers or the poor people are often the receiver of service from more well-off and benevolent givers. So when I started realizing this sort of dominant image of volunteer, I felt that it was just really incongruent with the kind of volunteers that I saw in my many years volunteering in the Philippines, where I grew up and where I worked. In fact, most of us who were volunteering in the communities also come from resource-poor communities and contexts. We experience the same vulnerabilities as the people we are serving. In fact, the people that I worked with in my research, this was a group of informal settlers who are fighting for land tenure, and a group of young people living with HIV, volunteering for sexual and reproductive health. They taught me that volunteering for them is less about service delivery of the poor and the rich and the well-off, etc., but it was more about solidarity. So it was about coming together, providing even the little money, the little time, and the little resources they have to address a shared problem. And that's where my interest came in. And this is where my interest around the idea of decolonization actually, or decolonizing actually came in, is that there is really incongruencies between what we find as a dominant image of a volunteer and what actually happens to the ground in contexts like the Philippines and the communities I work with. Let me give an example. A common aspect of volunteering in an organization is that it should be done out of free will. Now, I think of some of the youth volunteers in my research, and with the very little job choices and very little internship opportunities in our city, they were in a job market and an economic situation that in a way was relatively coercing them to participate in volunteering activities despite their desire to have paid job, because there was just none available. So they go to volunteering so that they can gain experience, get a small stipend, expand their networks, etc. So my question is, should they not be considered as volunteers? So the other characteristic is that volunteering should be done for free. But some of the young volunteers I work with, as young as 15 years old in the Philippines, they were already expected to contribute to their family's income. And the little money that they gain from volunteering was not extra income or extra stipend. It was essential to their family's survival. And so, therefore, these volunteers, these youth volunteers, they have different motivations. One of them is financial, but it's not only that, right? They were also motivated by a host of other motivations, such as solidarity, self-help, mutual aid, etc. Now, for me, these issues of definitions and the way we understand volunteering, etc. This is not only at the level of speak. This is not only wordplay. For me, how people understand volunteering impacts the way people do volunteering, and impacts the way IVCOs, for example, or other development programs create programs for volunteering or create volunteering programs. It impacts where the resources go, what tasks are reserved to certain volunteers over others. So let me give you an example. I remember I was talking to a staff member of this youth volunteering organization. I was asking them what she was telling me that, I'm really confused. Why are volunteers asking for stipends and allowances as if the value of volunteerism is gone? Or there's this other research in Peru where when a staff member was asked why women in health programs were often seen as volunteers, their answer was, well, because volunteering is an extension of their maternal role, of their caring role. So for me, efforts to decolonize volunteering practices, particularly its role within development, is also about tracing where these definitions come from and how powerful they are in shaping what is allowed, what is not allowed, and what are the rules of the volunteering game. According to Matt Billy Smith and Sean Hazeldine, by naming definitions that are rooted in the experience of the global north as universal, particular forms of volunteering are privileged over others. And I extend that to argue that certain volunteers are also being privileged over others. So what does this mean for volunteering for development? What does this mean in terms of research, which is basically what I am asked to do or to share with you today? There are two things in terms of how we can move this forward. The first one, an important aspect or an important starting point actually, is to revisit the kinds of questions or research questions that we are asking. So for example, the common query is almost like, how does volunteering lead to development? So for me, this could be expanded by asking, how can volunteering lead to what kind of development and for whom? So the latter question recognizes that development could come in many forms. So development is not only one thing, right? For other people, development is only about economic development, but it could also be about peace building. It could be about gender equality, health equity, social justice. So what do we really mean when we speak about development? Asking for whom, right, signals the awareness of kind of the power dynamics and inequalities in any development effort. And volunteers are not homogeneous group, right? So volunteers could be women, youth, people with disabilities, informal settlers, indigenous groups. And these types of volunteers have varying volunteering experiences, varying activities, aspirations, and are being impacted by development differently. So that's one. It's the kind of questions we're asking. And my suggestion would be to expand that a little bit. The second thing is, apart from reconfiguring our questions, we must also look into how we are finding out the answers. So cross-country comparisons, global surveys, volunteer work measurements, these are really important, but to me, they only tell us part of the story. Ethnographic approaches, such as mine, where I spent about 11 months with a community, where my approach, I did not just go there to interview people, I went there to live with a community, to participate in their tasks. These types of approaches focuses on understanding practices of everyday life, have the capacity to generate very contextual insights on how volunteering is enmeshed into local culture. So they can reveal power inequalities, they can reveal the possibility of volunteering to even counterintuitively expand inequalities, like, you know, they can expand gender inequalities, for example, just like the example that I gave earlier. So the kinds of complexities that I described earlier in terms of how volunteering looks like in the communities where I work, especially with the young people, they were made visible because I made a decision at the beginning of my research that I will use an ethnographic approach, really understanding volunteering from the point of view of the community members. The other thing that I think is important is action research generated by practitioners. I think there is still, especially even in IVCOs and the forum, for instance, in other organizations, there's still this thinking that research on volunteering is the domain of academics. And I don't think that's true. I think there's also a lot of impact generated by action research by practitioners, where the aim is not only producing new knowledge about volunteering, but also changing and improving their practices. So there are also participatory approaches to research, more creative approaches, where volunteers themselves take on the role as research leaders or key research partners, as opposed to just being subjects whom we study. So through these research methods, what it really helps us to do is to gain insight into the volunteering practices that these communities are already engaged with. And just to end, for me, at the end of the day, being aware of these knowledge hierarchies, right? And acknowledging how our definitions and concepts of volunteering are very complex, right? And impacts our practices, our programs, etc. This is an important aspect of any effort to decolonize volunteering for development. My invitation really is for us to understand the pre-existing systems of volunteerism, informal networks of support, local leadership among the volunteers, in building on that before launching into our own development programs and interventions. And I'm very happy to continue the conversation in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was very interesting. And I'd now like to invite Arathi to present to us some of her thinking.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Arathi, and it's a pleasure to be here today. And thank you, Stephen, for the introductions. I want to ask this of all of us. What is the gaze that you put on in which to understand the world and other people's positionality within them? And it is in this vein I ask the questions that I ask. As complexity and uncertainty recasts our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world, it also provokes new answers to the question, what does it mean to be human in these 21st century futures? To design anew as we think about this in the volunteering for development space, we must look at what has gotten us here. What are the systems that exist in which we all play in? How do they play out in all people's experiences, and why? We assume emancipation and liberation through development cooperation, but without a critical understanding of power, of who is deliberately seen or exploited, might in fact the work we do paradoxically expose or expand harm on often marginalized, minoritized peoples. And in fact, are the futures that we are chasing merely replicating or reinforcing existing or past inequalities? Are we building systems and programs to justify our continued roles and positions within them? Is volunteering for development programs, in fact, colonialist? Before answering that, let's understand what the terms actually mean. A colonial relationship is hierarchical, extractive, and exploitative. It produces uneven consequences and malevolent paternalisms. Colonial relationships create presumed superiority and infertility, hierarchies between colonizing and colonized people and places. They are also extractive. The uneven consequences of colonialism are felt across the entire system. In the realms of knowledge, science, and technology, risks are generally borne by colonial subjects, while metropolitan elites assume the role of developers and innovators of new ideas and technologies. The malevolent paternalism of colonial relations means that solutions are always proffered in the name of and for the good of the colonized, yet the colonized themselves are not recognized as full and legitimate participants in producing these solutions. Zuba Wei provokes us. How many Africans do you see walking around doing field work in Western societies? She further says, if you do not understand that going to the field in Africa or elsewhere in the global South exists beyond mere intellectual curiosity or knowledge production, that it carries the imprints of colonial knowledge regimes and fetishes, then you are delusional and dishonest. And be mindful, therefore, of the colonial foundations of your practice and the objectifying relations in which it is caught. So if that is coloniality and colonization, what does it mean to be decolonial, to undertake decolonization? Decolonization is the process of undoing and giving up social and economic power and restoring what has been taken away in the past. However, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang argue, decolonization is not a metaphor for diversity and inclusion, nor is it a replacement for social justice efforts. To be decolonial in our efforts, the act of decoloniality, is an aspiration to restore, renew, elevate, rediscover, acknowledge, and validate the multiplicity of lives, lived experiences, culture, and knowledge of indigenous peoples, people of color, and colonized people, as well as to decenter hetero and cis normativity, gender hierarchies, and racial privilege. There's a core part of this that is also integral. Those of us that are part of framing the problem cannot also be the only ones framing the solution. I think of this as, how do we exist in plurality, in a multiverse, so to speak? And to include this in programming and design, not as a tokenistic virtue signaling flag, but rather to help us consider the different lenses, perspectives, sources of truth, and even how we think about what is right, what is fair, and what is just. I put forward here some provocations for you to consider as you recast and rethink volunteering for development program and design through the lens of decolonization. Is the work being done a form of reparations? How do you meaningfully center communities in decision-making, not just participation and inclusion? How do you move from perspectives of leadership to ones of solidarity and of allyship? And this is a question we don't often ask of ourselves. What must you give up to make this happen? Recasting through the lens of decolonization also requires an analysis of power. And power in this regard means four things. And I'm being very specific here because we often talk about power, but we don't unpack what power actually means. So in this vein, power, I argue, means four things. Who does what? Who sets the agenda? Who gets what? And who decides what? It also requires an understanding an acknowledgement of our positionality, the lens and position and reflections and our views of the world and how it influences the decisions we make. The legitimacy of what constitutes knowledge and expertise. Who do we consider the expert? Who is building capacity and for what purpose? And by what authority do they have to build that capacity? The privileging forces of racial privilege, caste privilege, class privilege, ableism privilege, and how it influences our axis of bias, and how all of these impact decision-making. And through this, the very integral elements of relational ethics. We in the sector have talked a lot about decolonization. It's become the word du jour. But as we're recasting forward, I urge us all to really think through what these terms mean. Where in the spectrum of colonization, decolonization, decoloniality, anti-racism, shifting the power, do we want to situate ourselves? And where in this do we feel that we have the rights to actually act? And where in this do we feel and recognize that we might actually have to step back? Decolonization isn't merely a technical solution, it's a deeply personal one. It requires an unshackling of our mental models and the emotional ties we have to the status quo. And it is this very unshackling of our mental models that will be the liberation of us all. I end with this. Anasuya Sen Gupta once put forward the following provocation, that Wakanda isn't just the idea of what could be, it's not merely an Afro future, but it's also a reminder of a past possibility if we were to consider what was taken away as a result of colonialism. So for all of us here today, how do we ensure that that doesn't happen again? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arati. That was really, really interesting. And so now we'll go to Nazmul. And Nazmul, can I invite you to share your thoughts on this subject?
Thank you very much. This is Nazmul. I work with the Action in Bangladesh and also engaged with the volunteers, working in the community level and also with the young people at the level. So let me share some of the experience that we have gone through over the last few years here in Bangladesh. So, the volunteerism, as I said, in the social change process, volunteerism is the DNA or the integral part of all our whole development interventions. So we have started, our volunteers are engaged in the community level. They are engaged with the marginalized community for empowering them to claim their rights and in the right realization process. In 2013-14, we have engaged with a set of expert volunteers, and they are coming from mostly from the other southern countries, and we are also engaged with the other volunteers who came from the EU countries. However, from the experience of the engaging with them over the time, currently we have taken the volunteers from the local young peoples and placing them in the grassroots level. Who these volunteers are? So these volunteers are motivated young people who have experienced engagement with the community, and most of the cases they are the university graduate, and they're also interested to share their knowledge and skills to the marginalized community. And often they're connected to the global platforms and community activism. These youth, how do you do this volunteering effort where the local youth volunteers are in the center? We go for open recruitment call for recruiting a set of volunteers, a new batch, and we develop that new batch, the new group, and we develop their capacity so that they are aware about the approach of our working, community empowerment working, and also human-based approach, and other issues. And we place them in the grassroots levels with the organizations and community. After some times, actually, what we do, we swap them in between the amongst the working areas and among the working places. So that this is for developing the learning sharing intervention. So whatever they have done in on place, if it is relevant, then so that they can also do it for the other places, or vice versa. Why actually we make this placement? So this is the because of we want to this is meant for enhancing the knowledge and the skills of the marginalized community, particularly the young people, to exercise their leadership and claim their rights. For doing so, these youth volunteers, these local youth volunteers, they actually do capacity development and knowledge sharing with the marginalized community and young people, grassroots young people. They do frequent kind of mentoring and coaching kind of initiatives, and also they link with the other youth networks and they develop support them to develop their networks. And this is for how can they mobilize the grassroots community, building their empowerment. In terms of linking and networking, these youth volunteers actually very closely support with the grassroots young people through the accompaniment process, through their everyday life kind of activism and working experience, and they also connect with the other youth networks and the other marginalized communities. So along the process, they engage with the locally elected representatives, politicians, and civil society. This is they do because of they wanted to engage with the community, with the service providing institutions to claim their rights. So yeah, and in terms of the shifting, as I mentioned, so we are now shifting from the expert volunteers to the local volunteers. So what the experience of our engagements with the volunteers, we have seen if we engage with the expert volunteer, we have seen that they are rich in terms of in terms of the understanding about the multiple contexts. And however, there is some few challenges in terms of engaging with the expert volunteers. That is the language barrier is a big challenge for us. In addition to that, we have seen the safety, security, and restrictions on movements is also becoming a very part and parcel of everyday's life, and that actually hampers a lot of the objectives to be achieved through the placements. And recently, the official procedures also becoming very lengthy for getting the approval and other kind of things. Sometimes the volunteers coming from the very different diverse context. And as I mentioned, this is a good, but on the other hand, sometimes there is also challenges in terms of cultural adaptability. I have seen that some of the volunteers actually they have gone through some of the cultural shocks to adjust to the local community. So there is a limited, from that perspective, we have seen that limited understanding of the local culture is actually sometimes very challenging working with the community. And also, since language is barrier, culture is barrier, so then we also see that there is limited space to share the powers with the community, with the local staffs and local stakeholders. However, if we recruit the local volunteer, we have seen that these volunteers have rich understanding about particularly young people. They are enthusiastic, they are motivated, and they are innovative. At the same time, they have rich understanding about the local context and culture, and there is no kind of language barrier. And yes, though safety and security and movements is the issue, but very limited concerns over there. And there is almost no official process getting the approval on these things, and they are almost ready to go to the community to engage with them, to work with them, to understand their issues, and also to share their shoulders with their issues. So since this is the similar kind of understanding about the context, so they can actually make really very good kind of transferring of their power in terms of knowledge, in terms of their skills, and in terms of building the networks. So from that aspect, we have seen that the local volunteers are really something. If they are enthusiastic, if they are innovative, they can really make the meaningful contribution in the marginalized community and for bringing the change. From that aspect, actually, we can make few recommendations However, as we said that, there is a one shortcomings and limitations for the local volunteers, that is probably they have limited understanding and experience about the multiple contexts across the globe. However, that can be mitigated through, capacity development and time to time, and organizing learning sharing events, promoting that kind of cross-cultural learning interventions among the local and expat volunteers. In addition to that, I want to focus on another aspect that, how can we create the more enabling environment for the volunteers in the grassroots communities or in their own settings, particularly, not only engaging them as a food soldier, but how can make them engaged in the decision-making space. That is also important. And finally, how I would say that, volunteers, those who are contributing in the grassroots communities and investing the time and effort, actually they need the recognitions from the multiple stakeholders, and also motivate them to the social change process. Sometimes, if that one, why I am saying that, sometimes we are talking about volunteerism is a probably for leading the in the emergency situation, but I can see, if we can engage the volunteers in the social change process in terms of lots of social inequality and social discrimination and power relationship, then I think the volunteer has a lot of potentiality and engaging in society in terms of their cultural, changing the stereotypes, social stereotypes, and in terms of changing the patriarchy, in terms of changing the unequal power relationship. So that can be very fruitful through the volunteer engagement. I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Nazmal, for your insights. That was fascinating. And finally, we'll go across to our fourth and final speaker, Lee. Lee, can I invite you just to share some of your thinking too?
Hi, everybody. My name is Lee Matthews, and I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. I'm so pleased to be with you today and to share this session with my wonderful panel members. Today, I'm going to be talking about decolonising programming, practice, and culture within the international development sector. But first, a bit of background. I've been working in this sector for almost 2 decades now, from running a small NGO in Cambodia to working with the highest level of government on modern slavery issues in volunteering. I'm one of the co-founders of a movement called Rethink Orphanages, which exists to prevent the unnecessary institutionalisation of children. We founded Rethink Orphanages in an effort to stem the flow of people, money and resources from sending countries like Australia, the UK and the US, for example, to what we call receiving countries, such as Nepal, Kenya and Cambodia. For the past decade, I've been also running a consulting company called Alto, where we work with INGOs, NGOs and the private sector, as well as philanthropic foundations, to really help them do better at doing good. A large part of our work is in the tourism sector, specifically volunteerism. We've worked with some of the biggest volunteer travel companies in the world to help them divest from orphanage tourism and other harmful practices and move towards engaging with destination communities in more ethical and responsible ways. Our world is in flux. Recent events such as Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, Me Too, Aid To, and ongoing scandals in the charity and international development sectors have opened up long overdue dialogue on crucial issues. Organisations and the individuals within them are having to reckon with topics that have been ignored for far too long, and now find ways to really address the deeply harmful systems and structures that perpetuate colonial ideals and harm those who are most disadvantaged. Volunteering for development is rooted in colonial ideals. International volunteering itself is based on the concept of charity, which comes with inherent unequal power dynamics that further perpetuate these colonial ideals. So even the word development is problematic. I mean, replace development with colonisation, and you'll see a repeat of the same systems and the same structures that have been used to oppress those with the least power. The vast majority of international volunteering flows in the same direction as colonisation did, underpinned by the same assumptions. If we're not actively working to decolonise our practice, we are in fact reinforcing these assumptions. And really, maintaining the status quo here is not an option. Yes, the landscape is starting to shift somewhat. However, it's really moving at a very glacial or snail's pace. Deeply entrenched practices such as global north-centred decision-making have really been critiqued for decades, yet they're still the norm. We need to be constantly challenging the power structures that prioritise the voices of those who are in power and have always been in power, rather than those who have lived experience and know themselves what they actually need. We often see the so-called beneficiaries of international volunteering. And when I say that, I mean those communities who are on the receiving end of well-meaning volunteers, silenced. Their voices are not heard. They hold little power to speak up or to meaningfully contribute to decisions made far away that actually deeply affect their own lives. They're expected to be grateful for whatever help comes their way. This narrative of helping or giving back, making a difference, doing good, is endlessly peddled in international volunteering communications and marketing. And it contributes to a deeply misguided and harmful belief that simply because a person has the time and money, read privilege, to volunteer overseas, then they must be qualified to help others that are less fortunate. In countries like Australia, our young people are primed from a really early age to see themselves as helpers. They're ready to go out into the world at often the tender age of 16 or 17 and benevolently share their skills and their knowledge with people overseas who they have been told their whole lives are in need of their help. The irony is that at the age of 16, in every other aspect of their lives, these young people are viewed by those around them, and even by themselves, as learners, not helpers. But when it comes to helping people overseas, suddenly they're helpers. Not because they have any special skills or knowledge to offer, but purely because they come from a place of privilege. Instead of helping these young people understand their privilege, these trips do nothing but cement that privilege. This applies to adults too. When we're positioned as the helper, we have no incentive to strive for effectiveness in what we do. It seems that just being there and helping is seen as enough. And at the same time, we see the helped or the beneficiaries being conditioned or primed to internalize this unequal power dynamic and see themselves as in need of help rather than empowered to make the best decisions for their own lives. Trying to effect change by implementing a charity model won't create the change we need. These problems are structural in nature and global in scope, and are deeply rooted in colonial ideals. In development work, even though we aim to solve the problems caused by colonialism, we're actually actively perpetuating them with the very systems we're setting up to solve them. It's clear that the sector is not changing quickly enough. Yet these conversations are happening, but they need to happen more and at scale. So how do we do this in the development sector? Well, first of all, change should absolutely be bottom up, led and directed by those who are directly impacted. But at the same time, this requires those who are in power to lead by listening, by actively demonstrating, talking about and practicing different ways of operating. Those in power need to challenge these systems and work to dismantle the entrenched power dynamics, attitudes, and systems that continue to allow harm to occur. They need to think about what it means to give up their own power and intentionally participate in tightly held spaces for critical thinking and collaborative reimagining of the status quo. At ALTO, we believe that change within organisations starts with asking some really tough questions. What neo-colonial assumptions or elements of the charity model prevalent in international volunteering underlie your organisations or even your own practice? Which parts of programming, practice and culture do you think need to change within your own organisation? What barriers might be in place? How can you have difficult conversations with your workmates, your management, your board of directors, volunteers, partners? How much of your organisation's business model is on the table to be redesigned or reimagined? How willing is your organisation to do this? Asking hard questions has to be followed up with action to affect real change. Listening to diverse voices, perspectives, and opinions helps facilitate these internal conversations and get people thinking critically. If we do this, this helps to identify harmful practices and interrogate new ways of operating and being in the world. Development practice isn't static, it's dynamic. We're always learning how we can do better. And ultimately, this improves practice and programming, meaning better outcomes for everyone. Thank you for your time today. And if you want to find more about our work, please go to www.altolearn.net.
Thank you, Lee, for sharing those thoughts with us. Very interesting. Well, that's the final of our 4 presentations. And again, I just want to acknowledge and thank all 4 presenters for their insights and for all the work that they put into to prepare for this session. Now, after a short break, we're going to go across to a question and answer session, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the 4 speakers. And can I encourage you to make the most of this opportunity to really connect and engage them in their thinking. Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this question and answer session. And look, can I start off by once again thanking our presenters, Nazmul, Arathi, Lee and Chris, for your very insightful and challenging presentations. And I think they're certainly going to stimulate some questions. I'm starting to see a few now already coming through, which is great. Just a reminder for everybody out there to be part of this discussion. You can send your questions to the Q&A box and I will pass it on to the panelists, or alternatively, and we certainly encourage you to do this, is to share your video and audio and come and present your question directly to the panelists. So please do take that opportunity to do that. Okay, we've got a few questions coming in, and I guess this first one that I've got is probably aimed at all of the panelists, and it's a question that's being endorsed by a number of people, and I'll read this out. And this is from Joseph. How do you see the almost absolute monopoly and hegemony of English in these debates at the IVCO conference? Is that in itself a form of neo-colonialism? So sorry, it's a challenging question to start you off with, but who would like to lead off on that one?
I'll go.
Would you? Oh, thank you.
My answer is yes. When language leaves large swaths of our populations out or makes it inaccessible for them to participate in learning processes, in knowledge sharing, in networking and accessing information and knowledge, it is a form of exclusionary privilege. What we're doing is privileging our language above others, and it's privileging our ways of communicating privileging our ways of communicating. We see this happen all the time, not just in conferences. We see this happen in education materials, in technology. When we look at the internet, for example, predominantly in English, what happens to all the other languages of the world? So yeah, my short answer is it's absolutely a form of that. It's a form of exclusionary privilege and how we maintain the status quo.
But if I go, Stephen, if you allow me, then
yes, please.
From our experiences, actually, we see this is the barrier even in terms of sharing the powers to the community or to the to the target group, to the grassroots. This holds lots of political aspects even in terms of the language for us. So people from our context usually do not feel very good when they need to speak in English with their volunteers when they come from the global north. So this is also part of this this whole volunteering mechanism. If you think about the global north to global south, even south to south. So I think this is a good discussion. Even we need to think about how we can also embed the communication models when a volunteer comes in from the different country and being placed in a very rural interior people. And this is a good question. In fact. Thank you. I think this is difficult to answer at this point, but it's a good question. That is nice.
Yeah, it's a very relevant, challenging question. Sorry, was someone? All right. No, well, no, I think it is a really good question. And as we all know, language is so critical. So look, the great question, Joseph, and hopefully the response of the panelists is useful or helpful to you. There's another question, and I guess it's a follow on from what you've been talking about, change. A question from Mark is, given what you've outlined today, what do you think forum members, and not just forum, all organisations working in the international volunteering for development sector, what do you think they'll look like in 5 to 10 years if they engage with the decolonial discourse? In what way would you envisage or expect them to have changed, and what do you think they'll be doing? So there's a few questions in that one. But I guess it's sort of looking into the future, saying, well, if we were to embrace this and we were serious about this, what does that mean? Anyone who would like to perhaps lead off on that one first?
Okay, I can come. The practice, this, from our context, I feel, the volunteerism should be developed from the community itself, those who are belongs to the community, and they have the some tools of empowerment, and they have some knowledge and skills that they can share with the other fellow group members. So we probably need to support to that communities. Someone should, or some people develop their own leadership. Someone develop their own practice to share their knowledge and skills to the other community members, so that they can collectively think of the change, rather than the change is coming from somebody else who is not actually belonging to the community. So probably we need to support to that practice more and more. Thank you.
No, thank you, Nazma.
I'd like to add, if I can, I think particularly for some of those organisations that are really running on a traditional volunteerism business model, I think I'd like to think that some of them probably won't exist if they meaningfully engage in this process of decolonising, or actually having some internal self-reflection around their business model. It might actually be that it is inherently flawed, and without a really significant change in structure and culture within, then maybe they won't exist anymore.
I'll try to add something. I hope you can hear me, because I've been struggling with my internet, but
no,
hopefully you can
good,
hear
Chris.
me.
You're good.
Yeah, no, I think I just wanna say, I think that the learning component of all these is really important. I think like what Lei was saying earlier about this bottom-up approach is also really interesting. and thinking about the pluralities of models on how to do development, on how to do volunteering, on how do we engage volunteers and in what way. I think there also has to be, and I say has, but I think at some point when IVCOs would look at this really seriously, I think you can look at how you deal with power relationships within the organizations, especially with local organizations. How do you view them, and how do you sort of frame their participation within your organization? And then the other, I just want to go back to that issue of language. I think it's not only about English as a language, but also the kinds of words and speak that we have. A lot of them is really jargonistic, right? And I think I'm coming from literacy studies. And part of what I argue is that bureaucratic literacies, when we speak with local volunteers with very bureaucratic language, what happened actually was that it enhanced inequalities in these particular organizations. So we need to really look closely about the kinds of languages we're using, not just languages in English, and also how do we communicate with people. They also have low literacy levels or differing literacy levels. The use of pictures, participatory materials, photo voice methodologies. How do they come in terms of communication? Because not everyone uses words or are able to access words. So I think that's also one thing that we could look at in terms of language. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think you raise a really good point there, and I think that's something that we can actually address quite easily. Okay, look, the questions are coming through. Now, I've got one specifically for Arathi, and it's from Fiona. And it's you mentioned the importance of reparations as part of the decolonizing process. What do you think that looks like in the volunteering for development space?
That's a really good question. When we talk about decolonization, it's linked to the concept of reparations. And I think that's a really fraught topic, because not all of us and not institutions that talk about decolonization don't often want to talk about reparations. So some of the arguments that have been, some of the academic arguments that have been occurring in this space is aid in itself a form of reparations if we turn it on its head? I like to, I guess what I was framing in my presentation and the space that I talk about is around decoloniality, which is the looking at different knowledge sources, looking at different experiences, and that's one of those fundamental differences. If you're talking about decolonization, then have a conversation about reparations. If you're talking about different ways of acknowledging different types of experiences, lived experiences, different types of knowledge sources, indigenous cultures, then that's a different type of decolonial approach. So when I talked about the spectrum of things, but my opinion about if we were to practice decolonization in the volunteering for development space, and this might be linked to the earlier question a bit. Let's follow the money trail. Most international organizations that send volunteers get money from their donor, and then that they act as the intermediary, and that gets funneled to whoever gets mobilized, whatever resources get mobilized, etc. If we were to cast that set differently and recast the role of the organization through a reparations lens, would that role actually change? Could money flow directly to communities? Could there be a different type of model that occurs where the money isn't invested into a northern volunteer going somewhere south, but it's actually invested differently? Right now, I used to work in volunteering for development. I don't do that at the moment, so I'm not certainly a topic expert in this space. But in my experience, we've been talking about south to south volunteering, south to north volunteering for decades, but we still haven't. It's still not a thing. So the question I would ask then is why? What is the fundamental blockage? What is the fundamental flaw in our practices and in our structures that has stopped that from happening? And how would we how would we restructure that? So yeah, I think the conversation on decolonization ought to have a conversation on reparations. It's very fraught, it's very difficult. Let's not diminish that in any way. If we're talking about knowledge sources, then let's talk about decoloniality. But if we wanted to talk about what would the model of the future be, follow the money, and how could that money be invested differently? Is my sense for it.
No, that's really, really good and helpful. Thank you. Anyone else wanted to comment on that, or? Okay, because we've got a sort of a follow-on question, which I think builds on that. And again, it's something that came out of what you said, Arathi, and that is, but it's actually, this question is aimed for the whole panel. And it's you spoke of reflecting on where we need to continue to act and where do we need to step back. And I guess that was something I noted down here myself when I sort of, you said the need to step back. Can the panel speak to how we can further do this? So just to repeat that question, which is aimed for everybody, is we spoke about where we need to continue to act and where do we need to step back. Can the panel speak to how we can further do this? Anyone have any sort of any thoughts on that? Chris, you look like you're about to say something.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I can speak. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
No problem. Yeah, I think I'll speak from the point of view of research, and I think one of the things that really spoke to me with other colleagues' presentations was that the importance of recognizing the multiplicity of perspectives over, big things like volunteering and also development. But how do you actually do that? It's important to also look at the tools that we're using in terms of recognizing people, in terms of listening and recognizing other people's perspective. And so from the particular point of view of research, there are already several, and this has been happening for decades, right? On looking at participatory approaches to understand community members' perspectives over certain things like development and volunteering. Now, the ability to listen or the ability to create this space, we always hear participation, I think, a lot in development, that we have to let people participate. But one of the critiques around participation is that we're creating spaces, but the tools we're using are practically the same. So even if you gather a group of women and then the kind of the way you organize, the actual space is the same, then you're not really challenging anything or any power relations, etc. So I think a practical way to move forward, or to step back and look at our practices, is to look at some of these tools, and some of them are available, and I can share some links later on. And I think the other thing really is this idea of reflection and learning. And I think there's always this thinking that you process the experience of the international volunteer, but actually the local volunteers and the local communities are also experiencing something because of the process of volunteering or of that interaction. So it always has to be two-way for me, right? Who reflects on what and which practices, I think, is also an important thing to look at. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
May I come in, Stephen? Yeah. Yes, and that is from my understanding, actually, we need to look back also into the mission and objectives of sending the volunteers to the communities, let's say, to the southern countries. So why actually we want to send the volunteers to these southern countries? So what is the purpose of that? So if we can rearticulate some of the objectives, that is the, and we can also look into whether these kind of objectives are achievable from the resources of the target sending countries. So if it is achievable, if the resources is there, so why we need to send someone from the very different context, very different countries? So that question need to be asked again and again, and then probably we will find some of the solutions. So if it is the mission is that we want to empower the society, we want to support the society. So probably we need to look into the why, how we can do that, even not sending the direct people, and what is the tools and practice we can reimagine under this achieving the mission. So probably then we may find out what to do, what would be our reshaping of volunteering system. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Gerasimus has asked a question, and I guess it's the This is the big one, actually. This is quite a large question. Has the time arrived to once again redefine development, or even better, move away from this divisive and limiting term? Sort of a fairly all-encompassing question, that one, but a good one. Has the time arrived to redefine development or move away from this limiting term? Anyone like to lead off on that?
I can jump in. Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things we've learned as humanity is, over the last year in particular, is this idea that who determines what progress looks like? Who determines what good looks like? Who determines what developed looks like? You know, these terms were created, over 50 years ago, chasing a very specific idea and created at a very specific point in time, point of our history. And what it's done is it's enforced a very hegemonic idea of what these concepts mean, that all countries must prescribe to a specific type of GDP growth, a specific type of technology stance, a specific type of infrastructure stance, a specific type of language, knowledge, and you must fit in a specific type of way. And the question then is, what have we lost through that? And are these ideas of progress and development and of good actually being beneficial to us? So, you know, one of the arguments we have is, yes, for the most part, we have seen incredible developments and positive developments over the last decades, but we've also seen incredible harm. And I think one of the things we don't do as a sector is analyze not just current harm that arises out of our work, but also future harm that may arise from our interventions. So we see now lots of debates around, are these ideas of growth still the right ones? Should we be talking about regenerative development as opposed to sustainable development if we want to consider planetary health as part of this? You know, should we be chasing degrowth concepts rather than continued growth concepts? So yeah, I mean, I think we have to really consider whose idea of development and whose idea of progress are we chasing here? And I might just link this back to the last question, because I think there are two things that I certainly draw on a lot about things that we might need to give up or consider in these spaces. And it's linked to this point as well. Positionality becomes really important, right? I'm a brown woman. I was born in Malaysia. I've lived in many, many countries, grew up in Australia. Now I'm in New York. But just because I'm a brown woman doesn't mean I speak on behalf of all brown women or all brown people or share their experiences. I have a certain amount of privilege, and acknowledging our positionality is integral in this process. I cannot and will not speak on behalf of other people, but I can speak of the work of my ancestors and my descendants and what this might look like. But recognizing the positionality we bring into it is already a key part of the process. The second argument is authority. By what authority do we stand here and define capacity development? By what authority do we stand here and define what good or development looks like in different communities, in different spaces? But who gave us that authority? Who bestowed it upon us? I remember very early on in my career, I was challenged on capacity development, very rightly so, by a very, very experienced Kenyan manager who said, by what authority are you standing here, young woman, and talking to me about capacity development? And it changed my entire perspective. So positionality, authority, how we think about ideas of development, progress, good, growth are all intertwined. And until we take a step and think about what are we actually, not just, we assume we're doing good, but are we actually causing harm, is something I would love, not just in the volunteering for development sector, but in the for good sector more broadly. I would love for us to do more analysis on that.
No. Yeah, very good, very good. Chris.
Can I add to that, Stephen? Yeah, I think apart from that, I think I agree with what Arathi was saying, and I think one of the things that I did in my research in volunteering in the Philippines is that I tried to trace what theories of development actually drive certain So, for example, of volunteering, where the idea was to provide services to the global south from the global north, and it was about developing economies that's driven by a particular theory of of development. That development is about increasing the amount of money you have in your country, etc. So part of the challenge as well is we try to unpack what development means in different contexts. And development could mean so differently in a context like the Philippines, where I work, as compared to the international volunteering sector, for example. You know, there are certain communities where volunteering is a negative term, that people don't want to be associated with volunteering. Or there are certain communities where development is something negative. You know, I remember I was walking with these informal settlers. One of the government officials said, "Oh, we're going to build a." He was pointing to a group of houses, and we're going to build a very nice building there, like a new mall. And then he said that's very good for development. But I was sitting next to a person who was just, who was just kicked out of her house, where she has lived for 70 years. And I don't think she means development when you think of, again, another form of demolition. So I think we need to make this visible. And like what Arifi was saying, who gets to decide what kind of development are we going to push for? Even that preposition, is it preposition volunteering for development?
Mm-hmm.
Why are we showing that volunteering leads to development? I think women in development, it's shifted. Women in development and women and development. In education, we don't talk about education for development. We talk about education and development. But volunteering, we're assuming that volunteering leads to development. Why can't it be volunteering and development? Let's unpack what volunteering means. Let's unpack what development means. And I think from there, we can really look at the nitty-gritties and the processes, the small processes that are happening within our organizations.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Leo, Nazmal, are there you?
Yeah, this is one point I can make, that is, in terms of development, I think there is lots of aspect discussion of the power sharing aspect in the community and among these various stakeholders. So until and unless the power is not being shared, or there is some kind of equality or equity is there, so there is development. And because there are lots of exclusion and stereotypes and also structural causes is causing the barriers in terms of the exclusion and marginalizations. And that is really difficult. Whether you have the financial power, it doesn't matter if these this structure is there, which is discriminatory, then there will be some people who will be falling behind of the whole empowerment process. So even we need to look back again the whole system of volunteerism, whether we are putting some people back in terms of the power sharing, in terms of the empowering, or taking that political decision that I need that, I need that issues, or I need that development program should be taken from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, the word development itself is inherently top down, and it's making an assumption that someone needs something from somebody that has more. And I think, just echoing what Chris was saying about this idea of volunteering for development, I think that's a really good way to pick up on a lot of the language that's used in the volunteerism and wider volunteering sector, is that it's making an assumption that we have something to offer, for one, and on the other side that it's wanted. And somebody is needing developing, or a place is needing developing by us over here with all the skills and the privilege in that narrative. So I think language, going back to that really first question, which is really important in how we talk about the work that's done through volunteering, and not making assumptions that people want, communities want volunteers, places want volunteers to come in, and just, again, linking back to that listening and not acting.
No, that's great. Thank you. No, that's great. Look, there's a question that's come from Raji, which I think is sort of continuing on this theme that you've just talked on there, but it's from a finance set. His question is, the divide between donor and recipient countries is central to the financing of development in OECD UN level through the setting of targets and so forth. How can this paradigm be changed without impacting the financing? Is there any thoughts on that one? We sort of touched on it with a bit of the commentary up to this point, but I guess what it's talking about is, the divide, that is driven by finance, if you like, and how do we change that? But without actually, how do we change that paradigm or that way of looking at it, but without actually jeopardizing or impacting the finance and what is needed? Any thoughts?
It's a really solid question. It's a tough question. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give the requisite justice to it, but the way I often think about this is how would we finance this differently? Where if X amount of dollars is going to country X, what are the ways in which we could finance that differently rather than the way we're doing it now? So I think I touched on this earlier. If currently we're investing that into resources mobilized from one country into another, is there a different mechanism? Is there a more innovative financing mechanism in which we can use those sources of aid? It's not to, inverting financing isn't it's not simplistic at all, which I think is what Raji is getting at, and I agree. But it also needs to touch on things like who makes the decisions about where that financing goes to, and who makes the decisions about how it is spent. But we also then, if we want to tackle that, we also need to tackle things like decision making. We need to tackle things like reporting, monitoring, evaluation, all of those very unsexy processes that support it, that hold up a very complex system. So I'm not giving this enough justice, but I just wanted to touch on and say it's a much longer debate, a conversation, not a debate. It's a much longer dialogue, and perhaps a very interesting one to have. But the thing that I would put on the table is, how would we finance this differently if we weren't financing, moving resources from place X to place Y, where those resources may not actually be wanted, needed, may cause harm, may not be contextually appropriate, etc. But we could finance it differently.
Yeah, look, thank you. I think actually
I would love to hear from my other panelists on this too.
Well, in fact, thank you for answering that, and in fact, that actually is sort of bringing us to time, I'm afraid, because there's a lot of really great questions coming through. So, can I thank all of our audience for participating and bringing these questions forward, and they're all really, really important, and they're very interesting, and we could probably talk about it at length for a long time. Can I also just thank the panelists? I've found this more than interesting. I've actually found this a very stimulating discussion, and all four of you have challenged us. And I think if we have left this session and we haven't felt challenged by something, then that would be unfortunate. I know I have been challenged very much with my thinking. So I thank you for that. I thank you for the effort that you've put into your presentations and for sharing your views with us today. And on that basis, and that time now, I think we'll probably have to wrap that up for the next session. But can I wish you all well, and keep up the great work. Thank you very much.